From 2018 to now, I've made thousands of charcuterie boards. I've mixed up and poured over $200,000 worth of epoxy in both tables and boards. There were many mishaps along the way that ended up wasting many thousands of dollars and a lot of valuable time. After years of fine-tuning the process and really honing in on my preferred method, I'm ready to share the entire process. I'll be sharing all the hard lessons I learned along the way so that you can avoid wasting time and money with costly mistakes. You can then take the process from charcuterie boards to bigger and better things like tables and furniture. I'm not being paid by any of these companies you'll see. They're just the brands that I've learned to put my trust in after many years of trial and error runs. Let's get started. The first thing you want to determine is what size you want to make. The beauty of making it yourself is you can make it whatever size you want. I've been really into the 12 by 20 inch, so that's what we're going to go with here. I also want to make some grab handles underneath so it's easy to pick up whenever it's laying on a flat surface. A huge help is being able to actually visualize that size up against some different woods that you have. So what I like to do is, out of any box, you can make it out of wood, whatever you feel comfortable with. For this scenario, we're going to make it just out of cardboard, since most likely everybody has access to cardboard. But what we want to do is carve out the 12 inch by 20 inch size of the charcuterie board and ultimately make it somewhat like a picture frame, I guess you could say. For doing one-offs, the cardboard is totally fine, but if you were to do multiple of the same size and you did them somewhat consistently, I would highly recommend just making a wooden frame. They're really durable and super easy to store. Now that we have our frame cut out, we can start choosing whatever type of wood we want to use. Now, I guess there's not a wrong type of wood, but I really do like to steer away from any super soft ones. Typically like to go with something really hard and dense, and in this particular scenario, I'm going with a maple burl. There's a few sources that I would highly recommend to get this type of wood, and I'll put those in the notes for you. Now we're able to use our frame, and you see how easy it is to visualize how the board's going to look? And it also lets you see where the waste is going to be, so it will help you get every bit out of that piece of wood without wasting so much. Now, after seeing a few options and contemplating a bit, I think I'm going to go with this right here. It's going to allow me to get 2 boards out of this with very little waste. So just give it a quick scribe with your pencil and we are almost ready to get this thing cut. And just so I'm safe and I don't screw up my piece, I usually like to allow about 1/2 of an inch just to give me a little room to work and straighten the edges and so on. So typically I use a track saw to cut this, and if you have one in the shop, by all means, have at it. For this video, however, I believe more people are gonna have a circular saw lying around the shop or the house or the garage, so we're gonna go with that route. And I'll show you why not cutting the perfect line is really okay for this. You know, the board's edge can really be as jagged and crooked and terribly cut, as long as the form that you're putting it in has a very straight edge. You see, when you start pouring the epoxy, it's going to fill in all the imperfections, and then once it's cured, it's going to give you a nice straight edge to work off of. And really, the same goes for how flat the piece of wood is. I mean, in an ideal situation, yes, you want it as flat as you can get it. But if you don't have the tools to help you get it perfectly flat, it's okay to just put it in there and then pour the epoxy, and it's going to fill in all those imperfections. Okay, so moving on now that we have this knowledge. So right here, I'm trying to figure out what side of the wood is the most flat. This side has a particular wobble. If I flip it over, there's still a little bit of a wobble there, but not nearly as much. So I'm going to choose this side to send it through the planer on. So with imperfect wood that's not completely flat, you're going to have to take it nice and slow on the planer. You don't want to rush it and try to take it all down at once. You really want to take it nice and slow so it doesn't damage your piece of wood. So now that we have that one side nice and mostly flat, we can flip it over and start working on the other one. I like to make the charcuterie boards a bit thicker than usual, so what I aim for here is to take it down slightly past the rough sawn part. So a little bit to go, and this should be ready to go. As you can see, there's no more rough sawn marks and it's all planed. And from here, it's really just about squaring up your piece to fit in the mold nicely. All right, now that our piece is shaping up, it is now time just to check those measurements and make sure that they're still going to work for you. The material for the form, you really can use anything that's nice and flat. Here is a piece of melamine, which you can use, but you do have to use an epoxy release agent. Most likely melamine's just not lying around your house or your shop, so for this particular scenario, we're just going to go with a scrap piece of lumber that I have lying around. This is just a 3/4 inch veneer core maple. All right, so if we're wanting an exact 12 inch by 20 inch, don't forget to add about 1/2 of an inch or so onto the size of the form so that when you take the charcuterie board out of the form, you can then cut it down to that perfect dimension. All right, next thing is to determine the height of the form walls, and I really like to have a minimum of 1/2 of an inch sticking above the piece of lumber that you have, just so you're not spilling resin over unintentionally. I'm gonna end up going with 3 3/4 for this one. Since we ruled out pre-made forms and we're not going to use melamine, we do have to put something down on the form that the epoxy cannot adhere to. House sheathing tapes work great. I love using this Bidwell tape that they have because it's so wide and it takes less time to cover whatever you're wanting to cover. Check out the notes on where to get this and what other tapes would be suitable as well. Now that you have all the components all taped up, now it's just time to measure the lengths and cut the sides properly. To assemble the form, screws are really the way to go. I use these really small T10 trim screws just because they don't split the wood as easily and they're really easy to get in and out. And more importantly, it's really easy to get your forms apart whenever that time comes. Now things are really starting to shape up here. You're really getting a good idea of what this thing is going to look like when it's all said and done. Cleaning up your wood is really the next step, and depending on what you have is really going to depend on how tedious this work is. This piece that I have, it's not really challenging, it's just really tedious and time consuming. It's really important that you get all that bark out. Number one, so you don't have bark and debris floating up in your epoxy and drying into your cutting board. And number two, you never want to pour epoxy onto something that could potentially break off over time. Didn't I say this was tedious? We're about just as far as we can get with a chisel, so now it's time to move on with a wire brush. You can find these at any lumber yard, any hardware store, most likely any metal store. You just want to be careful and be kind of gentle with this. Sometimes those wire brushes can really eat down into the wood, and you really want to try to avoid that. All right, we're getting close. Now it's just time to clean off the wood, clean off the forms, and get ready to put a little silicone on these edges. The ultimate goal with siliconing these corners and edges is to just pretend water's going in this. You want this to be as sealed and watertight as possible. I use just 100% silicone, and it's always seemed to do the trick just nicely for me. And I'm sure you guys all know how to use a caulking gun. You just want to squeeze a small bead in the corner, not too much, not too little, just right. And I usually like to come back and squeeze it all in there with my finger just to make sure the bead is spread out properly and you're not missing any spots either. So this is really important. You always want to put the wood in while the silicone is wet, because if you let it dry and then put it in there, the wood's not going to be able to set flat onto the surface. You just need to be gentle when you're putting it in. You don't want to move it around too much and interrupt that silicone. So when you're pouring the epoxy, it is liquid. The wood is going to want to float up if you don't hold that down somehow. I like to take 2 little blocks, wrap them with the same tape so they don't adhere to the epoxy, and those are going to be little hold downs for your wood so it won't float up on you. You just want to make sure you don't over tighten these screws. It could kind of deform the form if you over tighten and potentially break the seal of the silicone. And guys, we're ready to pour. Ideally, you want a temperature controlled room that's not going to be dusty. All right, let's put our math hats on. So we're trying to find the ounces that is going to go into this board. Now, to do that, you have to find the cubic inches. What I'm doing here is putting a dash at every 4 inches. and I'm going to measure across the void on each one of the hash marks. I'm now going to figure out the average of each one of those measurements by dividing that by how many measurements we took. In this case, it was 6. So we're going to get an average of 4.33 inches across. Taking our average width and multiplying it by the length of the board, which is 20 inches, giving us a total of 86.6. Now we have to determine the thickness of this thing, which is 2 inches. So we're going to go back and multiply that by 2 inches, giving us a grand total of 173.2 cubic inches. Now you might as well just take advantage of Google here and throw that cubic inches to ounces into Google, and it will very quickly spit out your answer. So right here, we are now knowing that 173.2 cubic inches converts into 96 ounces of epoxy. The last thing to consider are your voids. Now these weren't taken into account when we were doing our measurements. Just based off of experience, I'm kind of estimating that this is around 15 ounces extra of epoxy. So we're going to make sure we add that into our total. So with everything said and done, our new grand total is 111 ounces of epoxy. Now, a lot of the buckets you get have ounces and conversions on the bucket. So we're going to look for the one that closest gets us to that 111. And lucky for us, there is a 112. And for the sake of easy math, we're going to round up to that 112. So as you can tell from the bucket, we are going to be using Totalboat here. Whatever you decide to use, just make sure that you're using a deep pour epoxy. If you try to use a top coat or a thin pour, it is just going to be a horrendous project. I've been using Fathom for 3 years exclusively, and I have only good things to say about it. It's a 2-to-1 ratio, so to figure out your ratio, you have to get back onto the calculator. So going back to our 112 ounces, being that it's a 2-to-1 ratio, I'm going to divide that by 3 and then multiply that by 2, giving us a grand total of 74.66 for our part A. So knowing that our part A is 74 point whatever that was, we're just going to round that up to 75. And then hypothetically, taking the difference between 112 and 75 should give us our part B. So going back to our bucket, we know that we need 75 ounces for part A. And there is not a 75 ounce on here. So we're going to go ahead and figure out the difference in between the hash marks. Being that these are 16 ounces apart, you just really want to start breaking these down into halves until you start honing in on that 75 ounce mark. It is an estimate, but it does get you close enough. And you are ready to pour your resin. There's really no science behind that. It's just a matter of hitting those marks correctly. Now on to part B. Sometimes it can be a little tricky, being that the resin is clear, to see where your level is going. But, really just take it slow, take your time, and you'll do fine. So as far as mixing goes, you can do it by hand, but it sure is a lot easier if you have one of these mixers. I'm using a Totalboat one, but whatever you decide to get, just make sure it is silicone. With a silicone one, you can let the resin cure on it afterwards, and you can chip it away and use it really as many times as you want. So when you start mixing it together, you're really going to see the two different components starting to mix, part A and part B. It kind of has like a different viscosity look, I guess. But the goal is to mix it until you don't see any of those little swirls lingering around. The edges of the bucket seem to kind of hold onto it a little bit, so make sure you give it a little hand stir as well. It's definitely not fun, but you don't want to skimp on the mixing. You really want to make sure everything is mixed up thoroughly. I would probably say a good 3 to 5 minutes of just mixing. You'll start noticing the more you mix it, the more crystal clear it starts getting as well. This is just personal preference, but whenever I come across a piece of wood like this just has such cool character, I hate to color it up with a solid colored resin. I like to think of it as something that complements the wood. For this one, we're going to go with Atomic Finishes Space Ghost Blue. Just so we keep that transparency, I'm just going to add like half a teaspoon. You know that old saying, you can always add more, but you can't take it out. What you're going to want to focus on when you're mixing is to try to minimize the bubbles the best you can. It's inevitable to get a little bit in there, but just don't go crazy with it. It's not necessary to mix it as long as you did on the first round. You just want to make sure you get all that pigment nice and mixed up. It can be a challenge to get a true sense of what the epoxy is going to look like because you're looking in the bucket and it's about 6 to 8 inches thick. In reality, it's only going to be 2 inches thick. So I usually like to get a popsicle stick or something you have, give it that 2-inch depth, and that's going to show you what it's going to look like. And all right, it's finally time to pour this. What you want to focus on is really minimizing the bubbles again. You just don't want to get air trapped under some of these nooks and crannies. Totalboat designs this deep pour Fathom with a long cure time in mind. That's going to accomplish a few different things. One, it's going to let all the bubbles rise to the surface. And more importantly, it allows the resin to soak into the wood before it cures, giving it a pretty much indestructible bond. And now it's just time to wait. It's going to take 3 to 5 days depending on your climate and your temperature of how long this is going to take to cure. I always have a little box fan going for some airflow and keep my temperature in the 60 to 70 degree range. When we pour epoxy, we've already learned that there's a part A and a part B. When the two combine, a chemical reaction happens that produces what's called exothermic heat. That heat then sits right above the epoxy you've just poured, and it creates somewhat of like an oven. With every epoxy pour, I just make sure to get a fan in there to create some sort of airflow to move that warm air to help prevent your epoxy from overheating. Alright, so 5 days later and the resin is now cure. I like to kind of think of this part as like the second portion of the charcuterie board. So going back to those screws, this is the reason that we chose to use screws, because it's so easy to get the form apart. And that tape then breaks away from the epoxy so easily. The sidewalls typically break away pretty easily. Now the bottom, you always have to get some sort of chisel or wedge to get that delamination process started. After you get it out of the form, you can get back onto that planer. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a planer that can slow down the speed of the feed, I would highly recommend to do so. If you don't, then you can still make it happen. You just have to easy does it with the passes. You can't take off too much or the resin will chip on you. So take it nice and slow, very small turns, and eventually you'll get it down to a flat surface. So you remember how we made this form about 1/2 of an inch bigger than the actual board that we're wanting to get? Well, now we're able to cut away some of these kind of rough edges and leave them with a nice and crisp edge. So with working with resin, you always want to go nice and slow whenever you're cutting or planing or routing or whatever the case is. If you go too fast, it does have a tendency to kind of chip the resin. All right, now we're ready to move on to those handles underneath that makes everything nice and easy to carry and lift up off of a flat surface. So this seems so simple to me now, but it took me years and years and years to figure out the best way to do this. We're going to use a template bit, so that means we have to make a template. So going back to our scrap pile, I'm just looking for any kind of 3/4 inch plywood that's nice and flat. So I'm getting this scrap that I have that is, again, 3/4 inch maple. The goal is to make this thing to where it can be used on many different size charcuterie boards. I'm going to mark this a bit wider than the board, so if we ever make a bigger one, we can use it on that as well. So we get our handles nice and centered. We're going to put a center line down the length of this whole template. And this, my friends, made my life so much easier once I figured out this little trick. I used to have such random shapes of these handles. I would have kind of rectangular ones, I'd have square ones, I would have circular ones. But what ultimately stuck once it finally hit me was you want to take the size of whatever sander that you use. In this particular case, I use a 6-inch orbital sander to finish these boards, and correspond the size of your handles with the size of your sander. In this particular case, I'm going to go with a 6-inch radius handle. Now, if you have a 4-inch sander, go with the 4-inch handle. A 5-inch? Well, yeah, you guessed it. Make a 5-inch handle. Once I finally learned this, it saved me so much time and not having to hand sand so much stuff. The quickest and easiest way that I've found to make this 6-inch radius is with just a huge hole saw. I like to take a nail set and just tap it in, just so the bit won't wander away from you. Now, if you've never used a 6-inch hole saw, you gotta be pretty careful. This thing will wrestle you around a bit if you're not ready for it. So just take it nice and slow. And also, guys, make sure that bit's nice and tight. So I don't think you really want them gigantic, so I cut these back a bit on the table saw just to make it a nice size. This isn't necessary, but I like to take a spindle sander just to kind of smooth out those rough edges. You will have a router bearing riding against this, so really the smoother the better. This will all start making sense very shortly, I promise. I always make a reference line so I can put this on the very edge of the charcuterie board just to make sure it's lined up properly, and then extend that center line down the edge of the board so it's easily visible. Alright, so here's the concept. This template sits on top of your board, so you can then use a template bit to cut out the handles. So we're going to have to figure out a way to be able to clamp this onto the charcuterie board while we make this template cut. I'm going to show you how you can do this with a table saw. If you have a dado blade, great. One pass, one cut, and you're done. With the table saw, it takes a little bit more time, but it's such a small cut that it doesn't take long. Our goal with this dado cut is to make it big enough that a clamp can slide into this slot. So this is roughly what your template should look like when you're all said and done. Again, so we can get things centered, make that nice center line down the whole length of the charcuterie board. It's pretty much necessary to get your charcuterie board clamped down nicely to your workspace, just so it doesn't move around on you. Now we can put our template on, and now you can kind of see how this thing is going to work out. You want to line up your center lines, and then line up your overhang lines. Then you can slide those clamps in there and clamp it down. We are going to use a pattern bit now. I will leave in the notes what pattern bit this is, but it is made by Freud. So when you set the depth, you have to make sure you don't take out too much. But at the same time, you do have to set it low enough to where the bearing rides on the template. I like to do 2 passes. The initial pass takes out most of the stock, and the second pass is kind of like a cleaning up pass. The way to get the cleanest handles is to start on the edge and take little passes back and forth. You don't want to follow the template on your first pass and try to bore out all of that stock all at once. Once you get all the way around it on your first pass, then lower that bit a touch and do that cleanup pass. And that, my friends, is how I've made thousands and thousands of handles. Now it's time to flip that board around and repeat what you just did. You know, the thing I would recommend the most is starting to become a theme of this video, but just take it slow. Don't try to take out too much at once. So the next thing I want to do is put some kind of profile edge on it. This is where you can put your own little touch. You can do a round over, you can do a chamfer, you can do really whatever you want. I do a lot of chamfers, so I'm going to stick with that for this board. You don't have to do this, but I just kind of like how it looks, and I think it really gives it a finished look. And now onto the sanding. I like to put a blanket down just so it doesn't slide around on me. Here's one thing about sanding epoxy that took me forever to learn, but now that I know it, it saves me so much time. When you stay on top of the epoxy with your sander a long time, it does heat up, and it tends to stick to the pad a bit. Even if you do have a dust collector, it still kind of gunks up the abrasive pad a little bit. And what that in turn does is it starts giving you swirl marks. Now, it might not seem like a big deal when you're at 80 grit, but the higher grit you work up, the more of the imperfections really start to show. I always focus on staying on top of the wood and getting into the resin, going back to the wood, getting into the resin, making sure I change surfaces frequently. The wood acts as a little bit of an abrasive cleaner, helping to prevent a lot of the gunking up, and in return getting the pigtail swirls. Now, a lot of the times you're going to have a little imperfections or little voids in the wood, and this is where CA glue can come in handy. Now, if it's too big, I would highly recommend getting some epoxy back out and filling the void. But if it's very small and minor, you can sure put a little bit of the CA glue in there, let it soak in, and the beauty is it has an accelerator so you can cure it very quickly and keep on trucking with your project. I start at 80 grit, and I can't stress to you enough how important this first pass is at 80 grit. It really gets all the imperfections out that are extremely hard to get out later on down the road. And remember making the handle the same size as the sander? Check out how easy this is to sand and smooth out these corners. And no need to sand the chamfer yet. If you did it at 80 grit, it would really eat down into the wood and take too much away. I like to wait till 180 to do the chamfer. So what a water pop or a grain raise does in the wood is it expands the wood fibers, kind of bringing them up and knocking them all down on the next grit change and preventing that from happening whenever you put the oil coat on. So the grits I go through are 80, 120, 180, 220 with another grain raise, and a final 400. And guys, we're almost there. I usually like to blow it off with some compressed air just to kind of get all that dust off. And now it's time to put some oil on this thing. A great way to apply the oil are these non-abrasive woven pads. Now, you have to make sure you get non-abrasive because there are some with a grit and you don't want to scratch your new board up that you've been working so hard on. So make sure you get the non-abrasive ones. Guys, there's a lot of great cutting board oils that you can use. I'm going to use Totalboat Wood Honey. You just want to make sure that you get something that is food safe. And now is really kind of when you get to see all your hard work pay off. The beauty of the board really starts shining through. You can see the transparency of the resin shining into the board. You can just kind of see it all come together here. When oiling it, you just want to make sure you saturate all the sides, all the nooks and crannies, and make sure you get a good coat on there. I like to let it sit for a few minutes before I start wiping it off, just to kind of soak into that wood. And with buffing it off, I usually take 2 rags, one to get the main bulk of it off, and then the second one just to kind of fine tune and get it nice and polished up. But you just want to wipe it all off, all the excess, until you can't get any more off. So there we go, guys. We made a charcuterie board. And if you ask me, it's pretty sharp. Nice handles. Picking it up flat. This thing turned out nice. And it's everything I've learned in these last 6, almost 7 years that I was happy to share with you. So, next thing is, go make your own. Take the same stuff and go make a table after this. Or charcuterie boards for your friends and family, or sell them, or whatever you want to do. Because now you know. And if you ever need to go back, watch the video, have at it. So go make yours. You got it. See you guys.